The midday sun bathed the park cafe in a warm, golden light, filtering through the branches of carefully manicured trees. The air carried the scent of freshly baked bread and the subtle sweetness of blooming flowers, blending with the gentle murmur of conversation and the soft clinking of silverware. This was a place for the city's elite, a sanctuary where the wealthy gathered over gourmet meals and fine wine, wrapped in the quiet assurance that they belonged. At the very center of it all sat Bernard Green. At 72, he was the embodiment of power built over decades, a man whose name commanded respect in the highest circles. He had made his fortune through real estate, then expanded into industries that turned wealth into legacy. Even now, with his gold-rimmed glasses reflecting the sunlight and a designer suit draped effortlessly over his broad frame, he carried himself with the quiet authority of someone who had never needed to explain himself. Opposite him, Marissa, his much younger wife, scrolled through her phone, her lips painted a shade of red as bold as her diamond bracelet was extravagant. She exuded elegance, every movement deliberate, every expression curated for perfection. Yet there was something distant about her presence, an emptiness behind her poised demeanor, as if her mind was somewhere far beyond the table she shared with her husband. A few feet beyond the cafe's polished patio fence stood Malik. He was small for his age, his oversized hoodie hanging loosely over his thin frame, his dark eyes darting from table to table. He wasn't just watching, he was searching. Hunger had taught him to recognize opportunity, and experience had shown him that places like this rarely spared a second glance for kids like him. The wealthy patrons never saw the ones who lurked at the edges, the ones whose presence was easy to ignore. Bernard adjusted his watch, his fingers moving with the same measured precision that had guided his business empire. He barely looked up as he spoke. "You're distracted again." Marissa finally glanced away from her screen, offering a smile that was just a little too polished. "I'm right here," she assured him, reaching across the table, her manicured fingers brushing his wrist in a gesture that felt more rehearsed than real. "You know how much I enjoy these lunches." Malik's stomach tightened as he inched closer. His eyes landed on Bernard's table, drawn to the pristine white bowl of soup steaming in the sunlight. He had seen meals like this before, but never up close, never his. Then something changed. A flicker of movement caught his eye. Marissa's hand slipped into her designer handbag. When it emerged, her fingers clutched something small, something glass, a vial. Malik's breath caught in his throat. She twisted the cap with a flick of her wrist, tilted her hand ever so slightly over Bernard's bowl. A few drops of clear liquid slipped into the soup, vanishing instantly. Malik's pulse thundered in his ears. He might have been invisible to everyone else in the cafe, but at that moment he was the only one who saw. Malik's breath hitched as he stood frozen just beyond the patio fence, his small fingers gripping the cold metal railing. His pulse pounded in his ears, drowning out the gentle hum of conversation and the soft clinking of wine glasses. He had seen a lot during his time on the streets, quick hands lifting wallets, shady exchanges in alleyways, desperate acts committed under the veil of necessity. But this was different. This wasn't a petty crime. This was something far more dangerous. The woman in red, the one they called Marissa, had just poured something into Bernard Green's soup. A few drops, quick and deliberate, vanishing into the golden broth without a trace. No hesitation, no faltering hands. The action had been so smooth, so effortless, that if Malik had blinked he might have missed it. But he hadn't. His stomach twisted, hunger momentarily forgotten as he watched her stir the spoon through the liquid. Her expression unchanged. She leaned in toward Bernard, lowering her voice just enough for no one else to hear. But Malik, standing just close enough to the open-air dining area, caught the words as they slipped from her lips like silk laced with poison. "After everything I've done," she murmured, her painted nails tapping the edge of the bowl, "you won't ruin this now." Bernard barely looked up from his phone, his fingers scrolling through some article or business report, utterly unaware of the threat sitting right in front of him. He hummed absently, adjusting his gold-rimmed glasses. "You're being dramatic, Marissa." "Dramatic?" Malik's mind raced. He didn't know exactly what was in that vial, but he knew what his gut was telling him. And his gut was never wrong. His fingers curled into fists at his sides. He should walk away. This wasn't his problem. He had learned that lesson the hard way. Interfering in other people's business usually led to nothing but trouble, especially for a kid like him. No one ever believed him. No one ever cared what he saw. But then his eyes flicked back to Bernard, the old man still oblivious, his spoon now dipping into the soup. Malik's breath caught. He had seconds, maybe less. Every instinct screamed at him to turn around, to disappear into the streets like he always did. But his feet didn't move. His hands didn't unclench. He thought of all the times he had been ignored, all the times people had stepped over him on the sidewalk pretending not to see him. He thought of the nights he had gone to sleep hungry, of the cold park benches that had become his bed, of the feeling that the world only cared about people like Bernard Green, wealthy, powerful, untouchable. But today, that man wasn't untouchable, and Malik was the only one who saw it. His body moved before his mind could catch up. He pushed off the railing, his heart hammering, legs stiff with nerves as he strode forward with purpose. The cafe was full, but the space between him and Bernard's table felt vast, like walking across a tightrope with no safety net. And then, just as Bernard lifted his spoon, Malik's voice cut through the air. "Don't eat that." The words erupted from him, louder than he had intended, sharp and frantic. Heads snapped toward him. A woman at the next table gasped. A waiter fumbled with a tray. Bernard froze, the spoon hovering inches from his lips. His sharp gaze flicked up, meeting Malik's wide, panicked eyes. For the first time in his life, Malik had the attention of every single person in the room. Marissa turned, her expression momentarily unreadable before something dark flashed across her perfectly sculpted features. Her lips, once curved into a calculated smile, pressed into a thin, hard line. "What did you just say?" she hissed, her voice cutting through the silence like a blade. Malik's breath shuddered out of him, but he stood his ground. His pulse pounded against his ribs, but he wasn't backing down now. "She put something in your food," he said, his voice steadier than he felt. "I saw her." A collective murmur rippled through the cafe. The once bustling lunchtime chatter had been replaced with a thick, suffocating tension. People leaned in, their curiosity piqued, their eyes darting between the three of them. Bernard frowned, setting his spoon down with careful precision. "What are you talking about?" His voice was calm, but there was a sharp edge beneath it, an undertone of suspicion he hadn't yet decided where to place. Marissa let out a soft, incredulous laugh, but it was forced, brittle. "Are you seriously listening to this?" she said, looking around for support. "A street kid? This is absurd. He's lying." Malik's chest tightened. He had expected that. He had lived his whole life being dismissed, being seen as just another kid begging for scraps. But this time, he wasn't asking for anything. He was trying to save someone's life. He looked Bernard straight in the eye. "I saw her pour something into your soup when you weren't looking." His voice was firm, unwavering. "If you don't believe me, smell it." Bernard hesitated. He was a man who had built his empire by trusting his instincts, by reading people. And right now, something in the boy's tone sent an uneasy ripple through him. Slowly, he reached for the bowl. Marissa's eyes darkened. "Bernard," she said, her voice lower now, urgent. "You're not actually entertaining this nonsense, are you?" Bernard ignored her. He brought the bowl closer, his brow furrowing as he inhaled deeply. A flicker of something crossed his face. Something Malik caught immediately. Doubt. Suspicion. Realization. Marissa saw it too. Her polished demeanor cracked, just for a moment. Her nails dug into the white linen tablecloth. Malik didn't move. Bernard's spoon was no longer hovering over his food. It was hovering over the truth. Bernard's fingers tightened around the edge of the soup bowl, his knuckles whitening. The scent was different off, in a way he couldn't quite place. The warmth of the broth did little to mask the underlying bitterness that lingered just beneath the surface. His stomach turned, not from hunger, but from the gnawing unease creeping up his spine. Across from him, Marissa's eyes burned into him, her perfectly poised expression fraying at the edges. "Bernard," she said, her voice controlled, but barely. "This is ridiculous. You can't seriously be listening to some filthy street kid." But Bernard wasn't looking at her anymore. He was looking at Malik. The boy's chest rose and fell in quick, uneven breaths, but his gaze never wavered. He had no power here, no influence. He had nothing to gain. And yet, he had stepped forward, shouting in the middle of a cafe filled with people who wouldn't have otherwise noticed him. And that, more than anything, gave Bernard pause. "Tell me exactly what you saw," Bernard said, his voice even but laced with quiet authority. Malik swallowed hard. His hands trembled slightly, but he balled them into fists, willing himself to stay steady. He had made his choice, and there was no turning back now. "I saw her pour something into your soup," he said, his voice firm despite the lump in his throat. "It was a small bottle, like medicine, clear liquid. She tipped it in when you weren't looking and stirred it real quick." Marissa let out a sharp, bitter laugh. "This is unbelievable," she spat, looking around for support, but the cafe had fallen into an eerie silence. People were listening, watching. Even the waitstaff had frozen in place, their trays forgotten in their hands. Bernard turned to her, his sharp gaze assessing. "Marissa," he said, his tone measured but no longer gentle, "do you have anything to say about this?" Her eyes flickered just for a second, the slightest hesitation. Then her mask snapped back into place. "This is beneath you, Bernard," she scoffed, shaking her head in feigned disbelief. "He's obviously trying to scam you. Look at him. Probably wants money or food or—" "I don't want anything," Malik interrupted, his voice cracking with frustration. His fists clenched so tightly his nails dug into his palms. "I don't care who you are or how rich you are. I just know what I saw, and if you eat that soup, you'll regret it." A murmur rippled through the cafe. The power was shifting. Bernard inhaled slowly. The weight of his years, his wealth, his experience, all of it told him that he should be in control of this situation, that he should be the one making the decisions, drawing the conclusions. And yet, at this moment, a boy who had nothing stood stronger than he did. His grip on the spoon loosened. Carefully, he placed it back onto the plate without taking a bite. Marissa saw it, and in that instant, something changed. Her polished exterior cracked wide open. Her lips pressed into a thin line, her fingers twitching where they rested on the table. She had played this game for years, knew how to twist words, how to manipulate a room. But this time, she had miscalculated. Bernard was no fool. And he wasn't a man who took betrayal lightly. "I want the truth, Marissa," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. "Now." She hesitated, her throat bobbing as she swallowed. "You're really going to take his word over mine?" she whispered, her voice trembling with something Malik couldn't quite name. Fear? Desperation? Bernard didn't answer. He didn't need to. His silence was enough. Marissa's breath came quick and shallow. The weight of the stairs pressing in on her became unbearable. The cafe wasn't just filled with strangers anymore, it was filled with witnesses. And then, just when Malik thought she might finally confess, she did the unexpected. She pushed back her chair abruptly, the legs screeching against the stone floor. "This is insane," she snapped, grabbing her purse. "I don't have to sit here and listen to this nonsense." She turned on her heel, ready to leave. But before she could take a single step, Bernard's voice cut through the air like a blade. "Sit down." It wasn't a request. It wasn't a plea. It was a command. Marissa froze. Slowly she turned back, meeting Bernard's gaze. For the first time since they sat down, he wasn't looking at her with admiration or patience or indulgence. He was looking at her like a man who had just realized the person sitting across from him was a stranger. The seconds stretched, thick and suffocating. And then Malik saw that flicker of something behind Marissa's eyes. Panic. She knew she had lost, and Malik knew he had done the right thing. Marissa's fingers tightened around the strap of her designer handbag, her knuckles turning white. The carefully curated facade she had maintained for so long was beginning to crack, and she knew it. Bernard's stare was heavy, filled with questions she wasn't ready to answer. But it was Malik's unrelenting gaze that unnerved her the most. He was just a kid, a street rat, a nobody, and yet somehow he had backed her into a corner in front of an audience that was now hanging on to every word, waiting for the moment the truth would either be confirmed or torn apart. Bernard leaned forward, his voice measured but carrying an unmistakable edge. "Sit down, Marissa." She hesitated. Now, reluctantly, she lowered herself back into her chair, but her posture was rigid, as though every muscle in her body was wound tight. The tension in the cafe was suffocating. Conversations had stopped entirely. The only sounds were the distant trickle of water from the decorative fountain outside and the soft clinking of cutlery as a waiter nervously cleared a table nearby. Malik took a cautious step closer. He had done what he came to do. He had spoken up. But now came the part he hadn't prepared for, the battle of proving his words against someone who had everything to lose. Marissa turned to him, her lips pressing into a thin line. "You have no idea who you're messing with," she hissed under her breath. Malik's jaw tightened, but he didn't back down. "I know exactly what I saw." Her eyes flickered, scanning the room, searching for an escape, but there wasn't one. Not this time. Bernard exhaled slowly. "Malik," he said, his tone even, "I want you to tell me again exactly what happened." Malik straightened, his pulse pounding, but his voice was clear. "I saw her pour something into your soup when you weren't looking. A clear liquid. She stirred it fast and then acted like nothing happened." Marissa let out a sharp, incredulous laugh. "This is insane," she spat, flipping her perfectly styled hair over her shoulder. "Bernard, please, tell me you're not actually listening to this nonsense." But Bernard wasn't looking at her. He was studying Malik. The boy's clothes were worn, his shoes scuffed, but there was something about him that felt honest, steady. Unlike Marissa, who was unraveling by the second, his gaze flicked back to his wife. Tell me, Marissa," he said slowly, his voice dangerous in its calmness. "Is he lying?" She swallowed hard. Her voice was laced with venom. Of course he is. Look at him. He's just some street trying to stir up trouble. I wouldn't be surprised if he was planning to rob you next." Malik flinched. The accusation stung more than he expected, but he refused to let her see it. "I don't want anything from you," he shot back. "I just don't want to watch someone die in front of me and do nothing." A sharp murmur spread through the crowd. Patrons whispered amongst themselves, casting wary glances at Marissa. Bernard rubbed his temples before looking back at her. "Then you won't mind if we test the soup," he said. "We'll call someone, police, a doctor, whoever we need to, and they can run a test. If there's nothing in it, then you have nothing to worry about." Marissa's eyes went wide, panic flashing across her face before she masked it with anger. "You can't be serious," she snapped. "You're actually going to let this little liar dictate what happens at our table?" Bernard's face remained unreadable, but his voice was colder now. "If you have nothing to hide, then you won't have a problem with it." She opened her mouth, then closed it again. For the first time since this all started, she was speechless. Malik saw it, that brief flicker of terror in her eyes, before she forced herself to smirk. "This is ridiculous," she scoffed, pushing her chair back. "I don't have to sit here and be humiliated like this." Bernard's voice cut through the air like a blade. "Sit down." The authority in his tone made her freeze. Slowly, reluctantly, she sank back into her seat, but the fury burning in her gaze was undeniable. A waiter who had been standing nearby, nervously wringing his hands, finally found his voice. "Sir," he stammered, "would you like me to call someone?" Bernard didn't break eye contact with Marissa. "Yes, call the police." Her breath hitched. "No," she blurted out, reaching across the table to grab Bernard's wrist. "Please, you're blowing this way out of proportion." Bernard looked down at where her perfectly manicured fingers clutched his wrist, then back up at her. Slowly, deliberately, he pulled his arm away. "The only person who has anything to lose by calling the police," he said, his voice low, "is the one who's lying." Marissa's breathing was shallow, her pulse visible at the base of her throat. The cafe had transformed into an audience waiting for a conclusion. The waiter hesitated, but at Bernard's nod, he hurried inside. Marissa's panic deepened. She was losing control. Her hands trembled, and then, in a final act of desperation, she turned back to Malik. "You don't know what you've done," she hissed. "You think you're some kind of hero? You're nothing. I'm not the one getting arrested today," Malik interrupted, his voice firm. Her face twisted in rage, but before she could say another word, the distant sound of sirens filled the air. Marissa's grip on her bag tightened. For the first time in her life, she was truly afraid. And Malik? For the first time in his life, he knew he had done something that mattered. The moment the distant wail of sirens reached the cafe, Marissa's mask cracked. Her breathing turned shallow, her fingers clenched into tight fists, and her gaze darted frantically from Bernard to Malik to the watching crowd. The walls were closing in, and she knew it. Bernard, however, remained still. He sat in his chair, his fingers steepled under his chin, watching her with an eerie calm that sent a shiver down her spine. This wasn't the husband she had controlled for years, the man she had wrapped around her finger with sweet words and delicate touches. No, this was a different Bernard, one who had finally seen her for what she was. The murmurs among the cafe patrons grew louder, the weight of their judgment pressing down on her like an unbearable weight. She could feel their stares, curious, disgusted, waiting to see how the drama would unfold. The sound of approaching footsteps signaled the arrival of the police. 2 uniformed officers stepped into the cafe, their presence demanding attention. The younger one, a sharp-eyed woman with a no-nonsense expression, scanned the room before locking eyes with Bernard. "Sir, we received a call about a potential case of food tampering," she said, her voice crisp and professional. "Can you confirm what happened?" Bernard didn't hesitate. He turned to Malik, who stood by the table, his small frame tense but unwavering. "This young man claims he saw my wife put something in my soup," he stated, his voice controlled but laced with an underlying fury. "I want it tested." Marissa let out a sharp, bitter laugh. "This is absurd," she snapped, standing abruptly. "You're really gonna let some filthy street kid make accusations like this? He's lying. He just wants attention." The older officer, a grizzled man who had seen more than his fair share of liars, narrowed his eyes. "Ma'am," he said coolly, "if there's nothing to hide, then testing the soup shouldn't be a problem." Her lips parted, searching for a retort, but she hesitated a second too long. The delay was damning. Bernard's eyes darkened. "You always were a terrible liar, Marissa." She whirled toward him, fury flashing in her gaze. "You're really going to take his side over mine?" she demanded. "I'm your wife." "You were my wife," Bernard corrected, his voice chillingly cold. "But you were never my partner." Marissa's chest rose and fell rapidly. "This is ridiculous," she hissed. "I don't have to stay here for this." She turned on her heel, ready to leave, but the younger officer stepped into her path. "Ma'am, we're going to need you to remain seated while we handle this situation." Marissa's nostrils flared. "You can't hold me here without cause." The older officer raised an eyebrow. "You're a primary suspect in a potential poisoning case. That's cause enough." The color drained from her face. The younger officer gestured to a waiter. "Bring us the soup." A tense silence fell over the cafe as the bowl was retrieved. The officer lifted it carefully, sniffing it with a practiced caution before passing it to her partner. "Get this to forensics," she ordered. "Let's find out exactly what's in it." Marissa's breathing turned ragged. "You don't need a test," she said suddenly, her voice lower now, desperate. "This is all a mistake." Bernard scoffed. "A mistake? You mean like the mistake of trusting you? Of believing you actually cared about me and not my money?" Her jaw clenched, and for the first time there was no performance, no carefully crafted innocence, just raw, simmering rage. "I gave you everything," she spat. "And what did I get in return? A man too old to live, too stubborn to die." The words hung in the air, their venom palpable. Bernard exhaled slowly, shaking his head. "So that's what it was about," he murmured. "You thought I wouldn't make it another year, didn't you? That you'd get everything." Marissa didn't answer. She didn't need to. The officers exchanged glances. The younger one pulled out her handcuffs. "Marissa Green," she announced, her tone final, "you're under arrest for attempted poisoning. You have the right to remain silent." Marissa shot forward, reaching for Bernard's arm. "No, please, Bernard, don't let them do this. This is all a misunderstanding. You know me." He looked at her, and for the first time, there was no warmth in his eyes. "I thought I did." The younger officer grabbed Marissa's wrist, locking the cuffs in place with a final, echoing snap. The cafe erupted into whispers. Some gasped, others took out their phones. Malik, still standing a few feet away, could hardly believe what he was seeing. As the officers led Marissa out, she turned her head sharply toward him, her face twisting into something unrecognizable. "You ruined everything," she hissed at him. Malik didn't flinch. "You did that yourself." And with that, she was gone. The cafe remained still, as if the weight of what had just happened needed a moment to settle. Bernard leaned back in his chair, rubbing a hand over his face. He looked tired, not from age but from the realization of how close he had come to never seeing another day. Then, Slowly, he turned to Malik. "You saved my life," he said, his voice heavy with something deeper than gratitude. "How did you know to speak up?" Malik swallowed, shifting uncomfortably. I couldn't walk away." Bernard studied him for a long moment before nodding. "You did the right thing." Malik glanced around, suddenly aware of how much attention was still on him. "I should go," he muttered, stepping back, but Bernard shook his head. "Sit." Malik hesitated, but when Bernard gestured again, he obeyed. "I owe you," Bernard said, "more than I can ever repay." Malik shrugged. "I wasn't looking for anything." Bernard nodded slowly. "I know, and that's why I want to help you." For the first time in years, Malik didn't feel invisible. He felt seen, and maybe just his life was about to change forever.